Hello everybody and welcome to the Fightful Boxing Podcast, September 26, 2019. I'm your host Carlos Toro, and before we get into the show, I want to remind you to subscribe to our Fightful MMA and Boxing YouTube channel, as well as our Fightful Pro Wrestling YouTube channel. We've got tons of great content right there, and head on over to Fightful.com for all the latest news in pro wrestling, MMA, and boxing. The latest Fightful Boxing newsletter is out. You want to take a good look at that. That's already up on the page on FightfulBoxing.com, as well as interview articles with the likes of David Benavidez and Mario Barrios, who are going to be competing on the undercard, the pay-per-view card of Errol Spence versus Shawn Porter this Saturday, September 26th on Fox pay-per-view. And we're going to spend a lot of time discussing that card. That's really going to be the main focus of this show. If you're listening to this on iTunes, give us your feedback. Leave us a good review on iTunes. We really do appreciate that. Helps us out tremendously, and hopefully helps the exposure of this show, as well as all the other Fightful podcasts, including the Fightful Raw and SmackDown post shows. The pro wrestling podcasts are going to have a bit of a change that we're already seeing in terms of how many shows we're doing, who's going to be on those shows. Sean Rassap is still going to be on the majority, if not all, of those Fightful Pro Wrestling podcasts, including Listing Your Boy with Jimmy Van, our Fightful owner. Always a great listen your boy with Sean Rossap and Jimmy Van. But now it's time for the Fightful Boxing Podcast, and I have not been on the show for the last few weeks, even though I said we're doing this weekly no matter what, but had a bit of a throat problem that really my voice was at the point where I really couldn't talk for 2-3 minutes straight, and I didn't really feel comfortable, so I wanted to be 100% healthy, or at least my throat be at a point where I can talk for more than 2 or 3 minutes and not have to take a pause every time, because that gives me a lot of more editing time, and I really don't want that. So rather do it all on one take, and really what a week to come back here. It's the Errol Spence Jr. versus Shawn Porter preview show. You're gonna hear from the two main event fighters. Errol Spence Jr. and Shawn Porter are gonna be unifying the WBC and IBF welterweight titles. You're also gonna hear from David Benavidez and Anthony Dirrell, who are gonna be fighting for the WBC Super Middleweight World Championship in the co-main event, as well as from Mario Barrios, who is going to be fighting Batir Akhmedov for the vacant WBA regular junior welterweight title. And let's start off with this main event, Errol Spence Jr. versus Shawn Porter. There's a lot of interest in this fight, at least for me. Not just in the fight itself, but there is a lot to really look at and really kind of analyze and see what the direction for PBC is going to be based on what happened Saturday night, and based on what's going to happen in the ensuing weeks when we find out how many people watched the prelim shows, how many people watched the pay-per-view, how many people bought the pay-per-view. That's really a story that obviously it does not concern Shawn Porter or Errol Spence Jr. in the slightest bit right now. But for the future of boxing on or at least PBC on Fox, really the direction of going into this 3-4 pay-per-views a year, it's a bit of a bold move after it kind of almost seemed like, with HBO going out of business and Showtime not really being a premium cable channel that does a lot of pay-per-views. Really, they only ever do pay-per-views whenever Floyd Mayweather is fighting in the main event, and in the case of earlier this year in January when Manny Pacquiao fought Adrian Broner. But aside from that, there were no other networks that really was showing pay-per-view events. And then all of a sudden, Fox comes out and they had the Deontay Wilder and Tyson Fury pay-per-view. Then they go into Errol Spence versus Mikey Garcia. Now they're going Errol Spence versus Shawn Porter. And overall, pay-per-view boxing, I think pay-per-view, I don't want to say that it's an outdated practice, because there's always going to be pay-per-view. No matter how many people will say pay-per-view is dead, or pay-per-view is, it's a thing of the past, shouldn't be a thing anymore. Well, I hate to break it to you, that's really not how it works. I mean, there's always going to be pay-per-view so long as the demand for those kinds of fights or for those kinds of events happen. It's still there. And you look at PBC's approach, and they're using Fox as this huge platform to really advertise and market a lot of these fights on pay-per-view. And it's hard to say that it hasn't worked out for them. I mean, you look at the pay-per-view buy rates for the Deontay Wilder Tyson Fury fight. That was pretty successful. I believe I don't remember if Deontay Wilder and Tyson Fury was Showtime or Fox. I think it was. It may have been Showtime, and I don't remember right off the top of my head. But the point stands that the PBC marketing for these pay-per-views has really, really been successful, in my opinion. I mean, you look at the pay-per-view buy rates for all the pay-per-views we've had this year and the Wilder Fury show that we had last year. And it's been almost all of them have been just a little bit above average. And, and also Manny Pacquiao versus Keith Thurman, that's one that actually looking like it might do pretty well on pay-per-view. You haven't had like a confirmed number yet. I'm surprised no one's really reported on a more solid number other than in the neighborhood of 500,000 buys, which is pretty good in boxing nowadays. But now you got Shawn Porter and Errol Spence Jr., who are two guys who obviously are two of the 5 best welterweights in the world. Some may argue that Errol Spence Jr. is the best welterweight in the world. But being the best in your division doesn't necessarily guarantee you being a solid pay-per-view draw. I mean, you look at a guy like Gennady Golovkin, who for many was the best middleweight in the world, but before facing Canelo Alvarez, his pay-per-views didn't draw jack. I mean, you look at Sergey Kovalev, the 2 fights against Andre Ward, both on pay-per-view. Pay-per-view buy rates weren't that good. But the key difference in all of those is that you didn't have a platform like Fox advertising and going up to bat for your fights. The platform, the way pay-per-view is being marketed, it's very unique nowadays in the sense that it's almost as if there's I don't want to say there's a forced marketing push, because obviously, you're marketing, of course, you're pushing it out to the masses, but there's a lot more exposure on these fighters on Fox programming, and really it's the idea that during, let's say, NFL games, we put out in front of 20 million people that this fight is happening and it's going to take place on pay-per-view, then that guarantees a good buy rate. Doesn't always happen, but you look at the way pay-per-view is being done and how Fox is handling it, it's a bit of a gamble, because because obviously Fox is trying to make Errol Spence Jr. into this big pay-per-view star. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And really, if Errol Spence Jr. wins this fight, you're obviously going to push hard. If you're Fox, you're going to push very hard for Manny Pacquiao against Errol Spence Jr. next year. And it doesn't have to be immediately in early 2020, but some point in 2020, that fight, I'm sure Fox would love to have, because that would be a huge pay-per-view event, in my opinion. And it's hard to really imagine how this fight's going to do on pay-per-view, because you don't have two, quote-unquote mainstream stars. You don't have a guy of a Canelo Alvarez or a Manny Pacquiao or a Floyd Mayweather or a Gennady Golovkin level type of star. Errol Spence Jr. is a tremendous fighter, but I don't really see this performing that much better than the his last fight against Mikey Garcia, which I think was, 300,000 buys. I don't think, and the reason why I take so much time talking about this is because it's very interesting to take a look at the business of boxing and kind of how it's evolved. People are, you look at ESPN and DAZN, they're obviously, their whole thing is they're pushing more of the online streaming schedule rather than a Fox or a Showtime where their focus is on television. And I'm not saying ESPN doesn't do television for boxing, but it's becoming abundantly clear that they're pushing more and more big fights on ESPN Plus and not on ESPN linear television. You can't really, you can debate me on that, but I really don't think that the focus is on television, but it's more on ESPN Plus online. But that's neither here nor there. And if this fight underperforms on pay-per-view, that could sort of drastically change just a little bit about Fox doing 3, 4, 5 pay-per-views a year. And that could really be significant, because if Errol Spence Jr. doesn't draw well for this fight, and this is a real good test for Errol Spence Jr., on pay-per-view in terms of gauging whether or not he's a major star or not. If Errol Spence Jr. performs well, then obviously Fox is going to put, every resource possible to try to push him as this generation's next big star. But if it doesn't, then we could potentially see maybe a bit of a shift in the 2020 Fox schedule, where we're going to see more bigger fights land on Fox instead of saving some of those for pay-per-view. I think that's really important to note in seeing where this fight's going to happen. But I'm really excited for this fight regardless. I mean, if we're talking just on the pure boxing aspect of this fight, I love Errol Spence Jr. versus Shawn Porter. I think it's going to be a tremendous fight. I think this fight is a lot closer than what some people may indicate, at least on the odds makers. I remember seeing odds like Shawn Porter winning by decision, but it's like something like plus 4,400 or something like that. I don't remember off the top of my head, but the odds are really in Errol Spence Jr.'s favor, and I don't think it's. And of course, I can see why, and I do think Errol Spence Jr. is going to win. But to say that this fight is, is by and large, a squash, or Errol Spence Jr. is gonna have an easy time against Shawn Porter, I don't think so. I don't think that's the case. I mean, you look at Errol Spence Jr.'s run as champion and his fight that got him the IBF Welterweight Championship. It's not like Errol Spence Jr. was fighting against any world beaters at welterweight. I mean, he won the title against Kell Brook, but that was a Kell Brook that was after after he fought Gennady Golovkin. So he had one broken orbital bone, and you can argue at that point maybe Kell Brook wasn't, physically he wasn't 100%, or simply, that fight against Golovkin, it did something to Kell Brook, and he's never been the same since then. And then he fought Lamont Peterson, which I think a lot of people knew that fight was going to end with Errol Spence Jr. stopping Lamont Peterson. And then came Carlos Ocampo, which, I'm not saying Carlos Ocampo is not a good fighter, but that one, it was the reason why that fight was made was because the IBF had Ocampo as the mandatory challenger. And Errol Spence Jr., I mean, he looked at it as, he wasn't fighting Danny Garcia or Shawn Porter next. He wasn't fighting Keith Thurman, but Keith Thurman was injured. So he figured might as well get rid of the mandatory, get it out of the way, because we all know how strict the IBF can be when it comes to enforcing their mandatory fights to their champions. So now you go from Kell Brook, Lamont Peterson, Carlos Ocampo, and Mikey Garcia, who I'm not saying Mikey Garcia is not a bad fighter. He's a top 10 pound-for-pound guy, or at worst, top 15, top 20. But this was a guy who was making the jump from 135 to 147. And I thought to myself, maybe, you can maybe talk yourself into thinking Mikey Garcia's boxing ability would be enough to carry him towards a win against Errol Spence Jr. But physically, Errol Spence had such a big advantage over Mikey Garcia. And let's be honest, 147 is not Mikey's best weight. I mean, he was already considered a bit small for 140, and now you're telling me he's going to beat a guy like Errol Spence Jr. at 147? Obviously, that fight, some people thought it was a lot closer than they expected, but of course, hindsight is 20/20. And so, Errol Spence Jr. has never really fought a guy like Shawn Porter before, at least in the pro ranks, where it's a guy that's going to make the fight incredibly difficult. And he's a welterweight. I don't know if you want to say he's in his prime, but he's a top 5 welterweight. And it's hard to argue Errol Spence Jr. has really fought a top 5 welterweight throughout his career. But now he's going to get that chance to do so. And Shawn Porter, I think the idea that his fight against Yordenis Ugas really took a lot out of it, and 2 did show that Shawn Porter really wasn't that good of a welterweight, then really he's kind of overrated. I think that notion's a little bit overplayed and overblown, because Shawn Porter, let's be honest, this was Shawn Porter win against Yordenis Ugas. This was not his best performance. This was not. And I remember when Shawn Porter talked to me, he told me, you're going to see the best Shawn Porter against Yordenis Ugas. And when I looked at that fight, I didn't see the best Shawn Porter. I did not see. There were flashes where I thought, look good, he might, he could do some stuff against Yordenis Ugas, but overall, I thought he tried to play it a little too cute, maybe try to outbox him, when try to do too much to show he's a better boxer. When really his bread and butter is making the fight difficult, fighting aggressively on the inside, and really kind of roughing up the opponent. I know, obviously, the whole Shawn Porter is a dirty fighter kind of tactic that's prevalent. I don't think. I guess by today's standards, you can say Shawn Porter's a bit of a dirty fighter. I don't really think, if you were to put Shawn Porter like in the 70s and 80s, he would not be considered a dirty fighter. Not in the slightest bit. But in today's era, I can see why you make that statement. But Shawn Porter's a guy who, maybe from a boxing standpoint, doesn't necessarily, have a leg to stand on in terms of being the absolute best welterweight in the world. But I think his overall ability and the fact that he's such a cagey fighter and he's very, very physical and he makes fights uncomfortable, doesn't make them pretty. That's the thing. He doesn't make fights pretty. And he can sometimes get in your face, he gets in your head, and he really makes fights hard to win. And I would say this about just about anyone Shawn Porter would face right now. Shawn Porter makes the fight against a guy like Keith Thurman or Errol Spence Jr. or Manny Pacquiao very difficult to win. And maybe it won't be the nicest, the cleanest win, but I do think that it will be I think it will be closer to what some people may imagine. I still believe that Errol Spence Jr. is going to win this fight by decision. I think in my opinion, Errol Spence Jr. wins this one by unanimous decision. I'd say maybe he wins 8 of the 12 rounds. 116, 112. But I think it's going to be an entertaining fight at times. The one thing that I'm really interested in seeing is whether or not Errol Spence Jr. lets his hands go and really is aggressive. Unlike what we saw in Mikey Garcia, Errol Spence Jr. really at times it almost looked like he just let his physical gifts be what won him, overpower Mikey Garcia. He didn't try that hard to knock him out. I don't know if maybe in a way he was still a little bit cautious and trying to see whether or not Mikey Garcia was going to do something or counter with something big. But I do think that Errol Spence Jr. maybe was a little bit too cautious, especially late in the fight against Mikey Garcia. I don't think we're going to get that from Errol Spence Jr. I really don't. So I do think that Errol Spence Jr. is going to win this fight. I think that Shawn Porter is going to look a lot better than what he did against Yordenis Uga, and I do think Errol Spence Jr. is going to throw more combinations and bigger shots to the body than what he did against Mikey Garcia. But I did promise you that you would hear from Errol Spence Jr. and Shawn Porter. And I did speak to both of them in a recent media call. And starting off with Shawn Porter, it was really interesting to see, he is a guy who loves talking with people. He's a very, very charismatic guy. He's one of the more likable guys, and he's a very smart guy. One of the more likable guys in boxing right now. And I remember, go back to an interview I did with him a long time ago, earlier this year, before the Yordenis Ugas fight. And I asked him straight up, do you want, with pay-per-view now kind of being a thing, is that something that you would love to have one day, a pay-per-view main event? And he said, absolutely. I would love to have a pay-per-view main event, and I would love to have one against Errol Spence Jr. or Keith Thurman or a Manny Pacquiao. And now he finally got that. And so we kind of revisit that very recently, last week, when I asked Shawn Porter about being on this stage and whether or not this fight is what will decide who the best welterweight in the world is. Because that really is a very interesting topic. Who the best welterweight in the world is. Obviously, the debate right now is either between Terrence Crawford and Errol Spence Jr. But if Shawn Porter beats Errol Spence Jr., would you all consider Shawn Porter to be the best welterweight in the world? Here's what Shawn Porter had to say about that. Your last fight against Yordenis Ugas was a really close one, and Errol Spence Jr. kind of carries a completely different style. He's, from a skill set standpoint, from a resume standpoint, from just about almost every angle you look at it. And when you look at Errol's style, how do you see that faring against your style compared to when you fought Ugas? Do you see yourself having an easier or harder time dealing with Errol compared to Ugas?
No comparison. I think styles make fights. I think, you said yourself, they're two completely different styles. I think that they both have, in Dennis's case, had things that present problems for anyone that are in the ring. I think for me, my speed and my quickness against Errol Spence is definitely going to be superior. I think my foot movement is going to be superior, and I think that it's going to open up a lot more opportunities. I think that Dennis in the ring with me, he was a little confused. He was expecting me to have a different style than I came to him with, and I think that really shook him up. So a lot the same. I'm expecting to shake up Errol Spence.
One of the things I remember when we spoke a couple of months ago was that you wanted to have a pay-per-view main event, on your resume. And so now that you got that, especially in a title unification, how does it feel being on this type of unique platform that so few fighters have had the opportunity to headline a pay-per-view?
It's been a lot of fun. It definitely has been an eye-opener as well. Someone just sent me a picture telling me that the fights were going to be shown in theaters, and I already knew that, but to actually see it and have a preview of yourself at the movie theater is pretty cool. I'm at the theaters every other week, so I'm going to do the best I can to sell the fight and let people know that they can go watch it at their local theater, and I think that that's awesome. It's been a lot of fun, and I've enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to fight week. I hope it gets even funner and gets more exciting. I know funner is not a word, but I hope it gets even more exciting fight week. It's something that I've been looking forward to.
Last question. Given that the winner will have 2 of the 4 world titles from the sanctioning bodies, do you see this fight as the winner should be considered the number 1 welterweight in the world?
You know what I do? I think that I and myself and Errol Spence are the number one and number two guys. You call who you want to be number one and number two, but the best part about it is one is about to fight two, and one is about to get eliminated. I think that after I beat Errol Spence, especially the way I beat Errol Spence, I think that this will keep me as the number one guy in the division.
And that was Shawn Porter, and it was really interesting. Really interesting dude. I love Shawn Porter. Yeah, he's been on this show. He's been interviewed by Fightful tons of times in the past. Very, very good guy. I do think he's the top 5 welterweight, but I don't think I just don't think from a physical standpoint. It's kind of the same thing as I said with Mikey Garcia. I don't think Shawn Porter, from a physical standpoint, has enough to overcome Errol Spence Jr.'s power in inside boxing. He's a guy that Errol Spence Jr. is so physically gifted. It's almost a miracle he can make 147 pounds with relative ease. He's really, really big for a guy of his size, and he's very, very strong. He's an incredible fighter, but now you're kind of started. It's obvious Fox is taking the approach in regards to Errol Spence Jr. not just being the best welterweight in the world. Errol Spence Jr. It's now Errol Spence Jr. Let's make him one of the biggest stars in boxing, and now he's getting a second fight on pay-per-view, second straight pay-per-view main event. It's hard to really imagine when's the last time we saw that from someone that wasn't named Canelo Alvarez or Manny Pacquiao or Floyd Mayweather or even Gennady Golovkin. Actually, I don't even think Gennady Golovkin has ever headlined 2 straight pay-per-views. Actually, no, he did. Danny Jacobs and the first Canelo Alvarez fight. Those were HBO pay-per-views back-to-back for Gennady Golovkin. But really, it's hard to argue. Aside from the big names in boxing in the last few years, not that many can claim that they've headlined 2 straight pay-per-views. And so, obviously, with that comes maybe a lot of distractions, a lot of outside commitments that may take away the focus from the fight. And I can see, and there are some fighters who aren't a fan of all the stuff that you have to, all the media obligations you have to do. But Errol Spence Jr. seems to be the kind of guy that is okay with doing that. He understands it comes with the territory of being a world champion, one of the faces of PBC. And I asked him about being on this stage for a second straight time and whether or not it was easier for Errol Spence Jr. to sort of be able to prepare for this fight and also fulfill all of his media obligations this time around compared to his fight against Mikey Garcia. So here's Errol Spence Jr. My first question, obviously, the last fight against Mikey Garcia, that was a pay-per-view event. Now this one being your second pay-per-view event. When it comes to sort of, I guess, dealing with the media or any obligations that you've had that doesn't necessarily correlate to preparing for the fight itself against Shawn Porter, do you think that it's been easier this time around just because you've had the experience of preparing for a pay-per-view event against Mikey Garcia, or would you say it is more or less the same?
I think it's a lot easier. Because the first fight, my first pay-per-view, I was, traveling to New York doing things and, then going back to California doing things. So, I was basically, going in and out of camp, doing other different things. So, I would say the first time it was harder than the second go around.
I asked Shawn this question earlier in the call, and I wanted to pose this question to you. Do you believe the winner of this fight should be considered the best welterweight in the world, given that the winner will hold 2 of the 4 world titles from the sanctioning bodies?
Definitely. There's no way around it. The winner is the unified champion, so I definitely think, it should be considered, number 1 welterweight in the world. I would consider myself as number 1 welterweight in the world anyway. So, with myself having 2 belts, it just makes me, by landslide.
And that was Errol Spence Jr. Boy, I like Errol Spence Jr. I think right now he is, in my opinion, the second best welterweight in the world. But if he looks damn impressive against Shawn Porter, and I mean completely dominates him, I can be talked into calling Errol Spence Jr. the best welterweight in the world. I can definitely be, you can convince me. I would still have Terence Crawford up as my number one right now, but who knows? Maybe in 3 days. Ask me again that question in 3 days. Maybe I'll have a different answer. So, obviously, this is not the only fight on this card. Not the only fight on this card. Not the only world title fight on this card. You got in your co-main event Anthony Dirrell defending his WBC super middleweight title against David Benavidez. And for those who are not aware of the story heading into this fight, it's very interesting. It goes all the way back to September 2018, almost a year exactly to this day. David Benavidez, already the WBC super middleweight champion. He lost the title after failing a drug test for, I forgot the exact name because it's a ridiculously long name, but essentially the central compound found in cocaine. He failed for that. And so David Benavidez lost his title, but he was promised you will get your shot eventually to win back the title. In the meantime, Anthony Dirrell goes on to beat Avni Yildirim by very controversial circumstances via technical decision to become the WBC super middleweight champion. And now you kind of have this three-man dance between Anthony Dirrell, David Benavidez, and Avni Yildirim surrounding the WBC title. Of course, everyone in PBC and in boxing is talking about David Benavidez against Caleb Plant. As in my opinion, that might just end up being the best fight at super middleweight you could possibly make right now. You can make a really strong case for that. But it's hard to ignore the Yildirim size elephant in the room. And that is, the winner of this fight is gonna have to fight against Yildirim, because Yildirim was promised he will get another shot after David Benavidez got his shot that he was also promised. And now it's kind of become this matchup of the old lion trying to fight not just David Benavidez off, but also retirement. Anthony Dirrell earlier this year kind of was hinting at potentially retiring at some point this year. And he wanted to go out, he wanted to make sure he wanted to go get out of the sport on his own terms and not when he's way past his prime, he's too old, and he overstayed his welcome. And it's a very interesting thing to listen Anthony Dirrell discuss that. When I asked Anthony about whether or not this fight will have any implications to his potential retirement, if and when that happens after this fight. So we will see if Anthony Dirrell is in fact going to retire. And here is what Anthony Dirrell had to say about this fight. When we're talking about a guy like David Benavidez, who's this young, very aggressive fighter, who has tremendous power, when you look at a fighter like that, do you kind of view that maybe that there's still a lot of growing when it comes to a fighter like that? And as a fighter with your levels of experience, do you see that maybe an advantage for you to sort of try to figure out, exploit maybe that inexperience against guys at the world level?
I think everybody has power, especially with 10-ounce gloves on. I don't know what kind of power he got. Every fighter he knocks out, he was supposed to knock out. Just like every fighter I knocked out, I was supposed to knock out. But like I say, I think, styles make fights at the end of the day. I'm going in there looking for the knockout. I'm going in there doing what I need to do to win this fight. If I don't get the knockout, I definitely can go 12. And I'm just prepared. I'm mentally, physically, and ready for this fight.
I recall, if I recall correctly, there was a point earlier this year where maybe there were some talks about retirement and maybe you want to end your career with a title win, and now you've already got that title win. Is retirement or talks about retirement still somewhat in the back of your mind as you approach your fight, or is that something that you've kind of put on hold for now?
I mean, you don't think of retirement in a fight this big. You think of the fight. You think of the task at hand. Was I thinking about retiring after the last fight? Of course. I'm getting older, and I want to spend time. Like, I'm not getting older enough where somebody's going to come in there and just whoop me or beat me. I'm going to get prepared, fully ready for this fight, and I can't wait till it happens on the 28th.
And that was WBC super middleweight champion Anthony Dirrell. But now moving on to the other side, David Benavidez, obviously this really young kid. He has all the talent in the world, and he made a mistake last year. He owned up to it, and he's a guy who it almost seemed like he has taken that experience and he's learned from it. I can sense just by talking to David Benavidez that he's a more mature person. And sometimes a mistake like that could cost you tremendously, not just in your career, but in your life. I mean, look, cocaine is not a joke. I mean, that kind of goes without saying. Cocaine is no joke. And obviously it can do irreparable harm to a guy, especially as young and with so much promise as David Benavidez. But it almost does seem like he has learned from that and now looks hungrier. He looks better. He looks more focused, more disciplined. We saw that in the win against Julian Love back in March. He looked phenomenal in that fight. Of course, he was expected to beat Julian Love, stopping him early on in the fight. But it almost kind of did seem like David Benavidez was a improved version of David Benavidez, not just as a boxer, but as a person. I asked him about, learning from that, as it was essentially almost basically the 1-year anniversary of the news of him failing that drug test being public. And I asked him, what's the difference between the David Benavidez from back then to the David Benavidez we see right now? It's been a year, almost a year, since the positive drug test result came out, and you've certainly owned up to it, and you're now back into this position where you're fighting for a world title. What about you has changed between a year ago when you failed the drug test and now?
What's changed is that, I'm getting older, I'm more mature. I feel like the situation did more good to me than bad. It's made me realize that everything can be lost. It's over a day, you know what I mean? So it definitely took that to mature me and see that I'm not going to, work my whole life, have my whole life's work taken away over one wrong, one error. So, I'm more dedicated, I'm going to value things way more, and this is just a fight. Dirrell is a great fighter, he's a champion, I take nothing away from him, but I need these fighters. So I feel like, I'm older. I'm stronger than last year. I'm faster than last year. I'm smarter. My boxing IQ is higher. And, when I'm put in these type of situations, I never feel, the best comes out of me. This is my second pay-per-view fight that I'm going to be a co-headlining. And this is where I want to be in my whole life. So I'm going to take full advantage of this situation.
The last time I spoke to you was actually in a media call from your last fight against Julian Love, and you mentioned how, you never really felt like you never truly lost the title because, you never lost it in the ring. Now, when you saw Anthony Dirrell win the title, what did it make you feel? Did you feel like maybe he was not truly the champion and it made you all the more hungrier to show Dirrell that you are the rightful WBC champion?
Definitely. I felt it as soon as he fought for the belt in February because I fought, 2 or 3 weeks after that. So, it was very hard just to go through that, seeing him win a title that was mine. But, he's the real champion. You know, he fought for the vacant title, so I'm not going to take that away from him. But knowing that was my belt that I have, I'm just coming in this fight very hungry, very motivated. I have about 3.5 months training. So I was very focused for this training camp. So this is the best David Benavidez you guys are going to see. That you guys have seen actually. So I'm very excited to go in there and give a great fight and get my title back.
And that was David Benavidez. David, he's an incredibly talented young man. He's a phenomenal boxer. I think he has all the talent in the world to be the best super middleweight out there. And this is a very loaded division. Obviously, as I mentioned, you got Caleb Plant, you got Callum Smith, you got John Ryder, you have Billy Joe Saunders, you got guys like Caleb Truax and Alfredo Angulo, who just is coming off a win against Peter Quillen, a bit of a surprise, minor upset win on FS1 not too long ago. And I think this fight's going to be pretty good. I think David Benavidez will win back the WBC super middleweight title. I don't know if this is going to go the distance. I really don't. I think David Benavidez, from a physically, I think he's incredible, and his power, his aggression, it's almost otherworldly for someone as young as he is. I think David Benavidez is going to stop Anthony Dirrell. I'm going to say 8th, 9th round stoppage. I wouldn't be surprised if he stopped him sooner, but listen, Anthony Dirrell's a crafty veteran. He's never been stopped before. He's never been knocked out. He's gone up against a lot of big names throughout his career, but he is past his prime. And he had a tough fight against Avni Yildirim, and David Benavidez is certainly, in my opinion, a much better fighter than Avni Yildirim. So I think David Benavidez is going to come out on top and become a 2-time champion. And we also got another world title fight on tap. This one, you can argue whether or not the WBA regular title means something, whether or not, people can say, oh, well, this fight doesn't, this title means nothing. This title, it shouldn't be considered a world title. That's what a lot of people say. That's what I think. I don't think the regular title should be considered a world title, but the WBA pushes it that way. And the fighters that are in these types of fights for that title, they do look at it as a world title fight. They know, they hear all the chat on social media. They know that. But even still, winning that title is big for their careers. And now you have a case where Mario Barrios and Batir Akhmedov are going to be fighting for the vacant WBA regular junior welterweight title. Now you may ask yourself, the regular title, the WBA, 140 pounds, isn't Regis Prograis already the WBA champion? Yeah, well, the WBA, in its quote-unquote infinite wisdom, thought another title must be made. There has to be a secondary title, 140 pounds. Even though Regis Prograis just won the title and he's going to be in a unification bout, and technically they don't really have a mandatory challenger, but they have to make a secondary title. And that's where we are right now between Mario Barrios and Batir Akhmedov. And Barrios is a very interesting case. Very, very rarely do we see guys of that size. Blackjack, you think, has him like 5'11". I think he's actually closer to 6 foot, maybe a little more than 6 feet tall. Fight at 140 pounds. I mean, obviously, there are rare cases nowadays. You got guys like Ray Vargas, who's very, very tall at 122 pounds. And you got guys like Sebastian Fundora, who is just... He is literally a towering inferno, as his nickname shows. At 6'7", I think it's 6'7", fighting at 154 pounds. And Barrios is almost kind of similar in that case, where this is very, very tall, very, very big, fighter for his weight class, still somehow making weight with relative ease. So now Barrios, undefeated, is only 24 years old, but he's already being hailed as one of the best prospects out there in the 140-pound division, going up against another guy who many consider to be a very, very good prospect at 140 pounds in Batir Akhmedov. And so now you got a very interesting fight between two unbeaten prospects for a title. That's very, very rare in the United States, because the way boxing in the U.S. is sort of made is that you build up your prospects, you give them easy wins for the first dozen or so fights, then you kind of start building him up slowly but surely, maybe putting a crafty veteran or two, and while you build him up as a legit contender, and then maybe you put him on TV, and then you start pushing him as a legit world title contender. This is not really the case with Barrios. Barrios isn't just facing a veteran, or at least a veteran of the pro ranks. He's facing someone who's essentially at the same stage of his career, albeit with less pro fights, in Batir Akhmedov. And obviously, a fight like this usually makes for amazing fireworks. And you look at the guys like Mario Barrios and Batir Akhmedov, those are two guys who are going to steal the show, in my opinion. I think this could be the best fight of the entire night. I spoke with Mario Barrios very briefly about what it meant to be on this stage, fighting for this world title, and really taking this fight and making it a statement bout for the rest of the 140-pound division, which you got Regis Prograis and Josh Taylor and Jose Ramirez holding world titles. Mario Barrios believes this fight will not just elevate him near the top of the 140-pound division, but also sends a statement to those champions. But look, it's no secret that Mario Barrios' time at 140 pounds isn't that long. He will eventually make the jump to welterweight, but he's not willing to go up to welterweight without maybe fighting a champion or two and picking up a title or two along the way. Here's Mario Barrios as I spoke to him earlier this week. You mentioned in the past, that there would probably come a point where you might have to think about moving up to 147 pounds, but that time hasn't arrived yet. And I wanted to ask, is this fight being for the WBA title, was that sort of, incentive for you to try and stay at 140 pounds a little longer, or was that always the plan, to stay at 140 pounds through the rest of the year?
That was my plan originally, with the move up, to try to dominate and to try to fight for as many of the world titles, as I possibly could. Right now I'm still making the weight comfortably. That goal, is gonna remain the same. There's no doubt, I'm gonna move up to welterweight eventually. But that time it isn't now.
In this very loaded division that has, as it was mentioned, Regis Prograis, Jose Ramirez, Josh Taylor, do you look at this fight and the platform that you're on, being on pay-per-view on such a big event, as sort of a statement fight to those aforementioned champions, and saying that you've arrived and you have your case being made for being one of the best junior welterweights in the world?
That's exactly how I look at it. Winning this fight. I feel I've really proven myself. My past few fights, but this one for sure. It's gonna put all of the world champions on notice. That I'm right there. I'm right there knocking on the door. To be fighting them next.
And that was Mario Barrios going up against Batir Akhmedov on Saturday, September 28th. What a great fighter! What great fighters those two are. Those are tremendous prospects. As I mentioned, I think that fight's going to be the best fight of this entire pay-per-view. Don't care. Some people may say that the opening bout between Josecito Lopez and John Molina Jr. might steal the show. I think Batir Akhmedov and Mario Barrios are going to do just that on Saturday night. And now a quick look at the rest of at least the televised portion of this event. You got, as I mentioned, Josecito Lopez and John Molina Jr. Not much at stake during that fight, but I think that's a really, really fun fight. Josecito Lopez gave Keith Thurman some early trouble in January when those two fought on Fox at the Barclays Center in Brooklyn. And John Molina Jr., look, we all know John Molina Jr. is maybe not necessarily a world title contender, but he is a guy that will make fights very fun and very interesting. I think that's going to be a very fun fight. I think Josito Lopez wins this one just barely on decision, but I think it's going to be a good one. And then you got on the FS1 prelims, you got Robert Guerrero against Jerry Thomas. Look, old man Robert Guerrero, I mean, look, I will give him this. He certainly has not looked bad ever since coming out of retirement. It feels weird seeing Robert Guerrero still fighting at this stage of the game when he's still really, when the last time he was on national television, or at least in the main event of a national televised card event, he would look terrible. And I thought, he's done. Shouldn't be fighting anymore. And of course, Jerry Thomas is not someone that if you beat him, you're really putting yourself in that world title. No, it's not. I mean, Robert Guerrero, if he wants to keep fighting for a little while longer, more power to him. I just don't think he has anything left to prove at this stage of the game. And then lastly, Joey Spencer against Travis Gambardella. Spencer's a really, really good prospect. I gotta say, he is one of my favorite prospects of the, in PBC right now. I don't know whether it's, at times, I look at Joey Spencer and I think to myself, this kid, there's a lot to like about Joey Spencer. He's tough, he's very aggressive, he's a solid fighter. But you look at the names he's put, of course he's going to win, he's going to dominate a lot of the fights that, or actually every fight that PBC has given him thus far. And it's going to be the same case against Travis Gambardella. But I don't know, but I think Joey Spencer is going to win this one fairly easily, as same with Robert Guerrero in his fight. I think those are going to be just more showcase bouts for those two. I really don't think they're going to be that competitive at all. I hope they don't end up being the stinker that was the FS1 prelims for the Errol Spence Jr. Mikey Garcia fight. And I'm talking about I don't even want to talk about that fight. But I believe now I'm actually even blanking out on the name, because I try so hard to make sure that I don't have that I forget about it. It was Charles Martin versus Gregory Corbin. That's right, now I remember. Charles Martin against Gregory Corbin, which was on the FS1 prelims for Errol Spence Jr. versus Mikey Garcia. God, that was one of the worst fights I've ever seen. One of the worst heavyweight fights I've ever seen. It was really bad, and it gave us one of the most unsatisfying conclusions ever, which was Charles Martin beating Gregory Corbin by DQ because Gregory Corbin could not stop hitting Charles Martin in the dick. Simple as that. He just couldn't stop hitting him in the dick, and that's why the fight would stop. And it was 8 rounds too long. One of the worst fights I've ever seen this year. So, but hopefully, the FS1 prelims this time around will not be as bad. And that about wraps it up for this edition of the Fightful Boxing Podcast. I did not think I would spend this much time talking about this fight, but there is a lot to love about this fight. It's a very interesting fight, just, with seeing how Errol Spence Jr. is going to do against a solid welterweight who's not past his prime, who's not physically compromised, who's not coming up from 2 weight divisions below, or, is simply not ready for that level. It's going to be interesting seeing how Errol Spence Jr. does against Shawn Porter. That's with the rest of the card. I think this is going to be a very, very fun card. A very, very good event, in my opinion. Really quick, but I do want to run down really quick some of the news in the world of boxing. Obviously, a couple of weeks ago, you had the Tyson Fury fight against Otto Wallin, and I have written about this ad nauseum, but on Fightful.com, about the controversy that was the ESPN basically telling Ben Davison, Tyson Fury's trainer, that the cut that Tyson Fury got in the 3rd round was from a punch and not from a headbutt that he originally thought. And really, that, I tweeted about it. It caused a massive firestorm on social media. I got called a lot of names, including one, my absolute favorite. I got called because of my tweet regarding me saying there's some serious media ethical questions surrounding the ESPN Ben Davis and Tyson Fury thing, I had someone call me a little twink twerp. That was, yeah, and I lost it. I thought that was one of the funniest, most ridiculous things I've ever heard. I thought to myself, goddamn, I wish I had the creative power, the creative juices to think of something like that. Think of something as ridiculous as that. But I do think that was something that needed to be brought up. Tyson Fury is not someone who, obviously, he's not someone, who was taking Otto Wallin lightly, or at least, he didn't take him lightly late in the fight, but to a certain extent, I thought that ESPN, as I wrote about it on Fightful.com, I thought ESPN shouldn't have interfered, or at least got in the way and got themselves directly involved in the fight again, in the fight by telling Benavidez the nature of the cut. That was a Nevada Commission job and not an ESPN's broadcaster's job. I'm not saying Joe Tessitore or Bernardo Osuna, were thinking, look, man, we gotta make sure Tyson Fury wins no matter what. Obviously, Tyson Fury is the ESPN fighter. He is the house fighter. Of course, ESPN has a financial interest in having Tyson Fury win. But I think that the way I looked at it is I thought, ESPN, Joe Tessitore was thinking in fairness and trying to do the right thing for boxing and trying to make sure all sides knew what was up. But the thing is, and I put this question up in my article, if the roles were reversed, would there have been as much concern with in trying to make sure Otto Wallin's trainer knew what was up with the cut? That is a legitimate question to ask, and I don't know if I have the right answer. Of course you're going to say, well, of course we do. Of course we do. That's what we want to make sure all the parties know, have all the correct information. And I applaud them in the sense that they were trying to do the right thing. But here's the thing. The mistake was on the Nevada State Athletic Commission's for not telling Tyson Fury and his corner of what the cut was supposed to be ruled from. Like, they thought it was a headbutt, and they thought, if it was from a headbutt, they would think, all right, let's just back it in. If the cut is too bad, let's not worry about it and just take the no contest, and that's it. Everybody goes home happy. Well, we go home happy because we don't get the loss, and the Deontay Wilder rematch stayed alive. But because it came from a clean punch from Otto Wallin, that changes the whole dynamic of the fight. And now, and obviously, because ESPN told them that, it changed the dynamics. It changed how Tyson Fury approached the bout midway through the fight. But, I mean, hey, I'm not saying that if ESPN hadn't done anything, Otto Wallin would have been victorious. But I'm saying there is a role ESPN and the media at large to fulfill. And there is a role for the commissions and for judges and for officials to fulfill. There's a role. They have a job to do. If one side's job is not done correctly, it's not the responsibility of the other entity to have to do it. It's not it's not the responsibility of the entity to sort of correct. That's not their job. And so that's essentially what I was trying to get my point across in my article with Fightful.com, and I do recommend you check it out, and not to toot my own horn, but it's I think I covered a lot of the bases pretty well with this fight. And right before we officially close down this episode of the Fightful Boxing Podcast, really quick rundown, bit of a shout out to my boys over there at AsianBoxing.info for, a few days ago, it was the 1-year anniversary of what I would consider one of the greatest flyweight world title fights in history between, Sho Kimura and Kosei Tanaka. And they were, I thought, in my opinion, that was the best boxing fight of 2018. I think best boxing fight still today Since then, since 2018, I still think that was one of the best fights I've ever seen in my life. And I do recommend you guys check that out. I love that fight. It was crazy. I called it back then. I still stand by it now. One of the greatest flyweight world title fights I've ever seen in my fight. Sho Kimura, Kosei Tanaka from Japan in September 2018. The guys over there at AsianBoxing.info, they were, along with CBC, the Japanese broadcaster, they were responsible for making that fight available to watch for free worldwide. Have a legal stream on YouTube. They were essential in not just raising the profile of Kosei Tanaka, but also shining a light on Japanese boxing in general. There is maybe a niche market in Asian boxing in those title fights, but there is a legitimate interest in seeing top fighters from all over the world fight. There are people that will talk about that and would love to watch those fights live. Doesn't always happen. As much as we would love to see a lot of the great boxing cards in Japan live for free, not always going to be the case. But when guys like Asian Boxing do just that and give us a chance to watch these kinds of fights, we end up getting something absolutely special. And I really cannot thank those guys, the team over there, for helping make that fight happen. I wish them the best of luck, and we got a phenomenal fight between Kosei Tanaka and Sho Kimura. And this week was the 1-year anniversary. I just wanted to point that out. For those who have not seen that fight, please check it out. Kosei Tanaka versus Sho Kimura for the WBO flyweight title. That about wraps it up for this edition of the Fightful Boxing Podcast. Head on over to Fightful.com for all the latest news in pro wrestling, MMA, and boxing. Fightfulboxing.com if you just want to focus on the boxing stuff. I'm Carlos Toro from the Fightful Boxing Podcast. You can find me on Twitter at Carlos360. That's Carlos, Toro 360 on Twitter. Carlos Toro, signing out.